Hey everybody, we're going to go through a couple questions that might help us sort through what this idea of cultural literacy is all about. So hang in with me. It is based on an argument by Patricia Pizzell, who is quite foundational in the field of cultural rhetoric. And it comes from a classic article written by her in 1990. That is eons ago, but sometimes classics have that lasting effect. And so we're going to parse it through. And we're going to walk through some of her logics. I'm going to forearm you by saying it'll be a bit of thick water, meaning that we'll be a bit philosophical, but there'll be a practical outcome. So hang in here with me. So to read, write, and speak is dependent on a possession of a certain kind of language and knowing when and how to use it. That's her presupposition as she defines literacy. It is an idea that we know not only the language, but we know when and how to use it. The university has its own cultural literacy. It defines what counts as an appropriate language and evidence to make a case in academic discourse. Now, discourse is a word that you'll want to know for a lot of college courses, especially in the humanities. It's a word that refers to speaking and writing in a particular group or a convention. In this case, the convention of academic give and go of conversation. So I'm going to now open a series of questions now with those two premises of what literacy is and the fact that even the academy has its own cultural literacy. Bizel wants to explore a few questions, and her premise is she's coming against a concept called foundationalism. So she sets up the whole scenario, the tension with which she argues through by asking a question: is the college supposed to be a one-way delivery system from the teacher to the student of such languages, or this particular one, if there is one, and skills in knowing how and when to use it, right? How to use this sense of language. So in foundationalism, there was this big movement at the time, and there was an argument in America about saying, should we go back to the classics? Do we have to just teach us, if you will, a canon of truth? And if we touch that, all things will kind of work their way out. And in the contrary sort of pendulum swing would be anti-foundationalism. And that means, hey, there's no set foundation, no absolutes, but everything is historical and, if you will, time-driven. You're born in a space and time, and therefore truth is relevant to that. Do we more so realize then, therefore, that we enact truth or discover it? In other words, is truth something outside of ourselves, something philosophical, something, if we can get a little more philosophical, Platonic? So Plato would subscribe to this idea, or is it possibly more of a craft, a sort of a social construction of an idea? So is it more of a cultural process, an experience realized as we try out ideas, more so than a confrontation with a foundation, you know, or a need to kind of absorb this set chunk of knowledge that's outside ourselves? So to complicate this a bit more, not resolve it yet, Vizel keeps stacking on these layers. She says, is this literacy, this cultural discourse, this, you know, social construction of truth, if you will, a product of race and gender and politics, or does it stand above and beyond this? Again, is it timeless? She's kind of setting up a paradigm, which is a cool idea of argument where you set two sides up and then you kind of flip it to say, I'll take a third position. Whose literacy then counts? Okay, so is it yours, if your construction of truth or aspect of your particular group senses that's truth? Is that good enough? Should we teach the classics? Should we teach difference? So there's a whole nother group that simply said, well, we can't really subscribe to any set moral code. So if we start saying, hey, we'll teach toward our culture or just want to expose people, that would be foundationalism too, because that would be saying that there's sort of a value system that applies and we would be prescribing what is good. So it became this interesting parry back and forth that occurred throughout the 1990s, late 80s, 90s as it led into it. And what we ended up with was something a bit different. And I think Bizel kind of takes us into it, and her work became quite a classic because of it. Should we teach skepticism? Interestingly enough, this particular form is still prevalent right now in most schools. So you probably were taught a version of this, the what we call a hip smirk. And she was being playful about it. It's that sense of irony, delicious irony that you would indulge with a wink to kind of say, well, it's not quite right. You know, there's a third position, and you can bring out, if you will, a critical viewpoint. So good criticism should always be in play. We should always qualify claims. We should always think about ways there could be other positions and ways to investigate something, to bring in new questions, new perspectives, to say, well, yes, but. On the flip side, skepticism can be its own end all, which is just to deconstruct things and leave them in tatters. But hey, we did our job. We left the field, you know. So what if the car's all apart and it doesn't run? Hey, at least we took it apart. So there's a sense of hip smirk. Let's continue. We've got to go beyond those two sides. And so now we're going to go to sort of the finale here, which will bring us. Do we shift the discussion from truth to process? And this is where she starts to, you know, bring the plane in for a landing, so to speak. Do we seek a rhetorical process? A rhetorical process is an idea that through language and discourse, through conversation, and through the strategizing of what, you know, might be the best way to persuade, might be the best way to position ideas, we might actually cook up the best formula here, where we don't necessarily have to capitulate to any of these three options of skepticism, foundationalism with classics, or this idea of just let's make sure you as a student have to be challenged with some kind of cultural difference. So can we generate a trustworthy knowledge, she says, and can we hitch it to a context? And you're going to see how this will play out. Could we possibly consider positionality? And she quotes a scholar named Alcoff. Positionality is a very interesting idea, and Alcoff is a feminist, and she states that basically, rather than think of, for example, a woman as naturally being nurturing, you know, and trying to make a foundational argument that somehow it's within your DNA and the person you are, or going and capitulating to the idea of difference, that it's totally a product even, say, of race or context. What about just saying that there are a bunch of variables in a given moment wherein there's a subjective empowerment, or at least a choice that you as a woman can make to say, I can choose this given these variables, or I might be very pressured to kind of go this direction because of these variables. And yet choice is still part of the equation. The critique of positionality also is that it's a little over subjective, as if you could steer the boat yourself. And so many people would say, well, what about groups? And this would be a Marxist critique. Just so we're not scared of that word, that's not necessarily meaning that it's aligning with communism or any kind of socialist political agenda. Just the idea that we should consider labor, and we should consider, if you will, groups and the way that they influence our thinking. And I have no horse in this race, so we're very clear. I'm not pushing or prescribing feminism or historicism or Marxism. We have to, sometimes we get these bell ringer words and we get a little concerned because it might be our first exposure to them. But positionality and its base level point is just saying we as a person are informed by our context, but not definitively shaped. Like we're not pushed to be someone either by DNA or by a prescription by a society. We're just we're allowed to be, if you will, like a pawn on a chessboard. We might, given circumstances, be very powerful, be very weak. Like, you know, a pawn gets sacrificed in a chess game. But sometimes it can actually, literally in a move, swipe out the queen, the most powerful piece on the chessboard. So what is positioning around that pawn, if you will, to kind of make it strong? Not a perfect analogy. I don't like the word pawn, but you get the idea that there's a whole game, if you will, of variables around your position that allows you to position who you are. We're going to land this. I'm going to double land because we're landing Bazel's argument, and we're going to get into practical things here in just a second. The second possibility is critical literacy. And this is from Graff, who also wrote a response to Edward Hirsch in a full volume in 1995. And he argues that we need to come to a critical literacy that allows for skills and content to interweave. And what we're really teaching in the classroom and really teaching through composition and rhetorical skills and engagement with truth is truth in a soft T as a combination of content and skills that's informed by context. Sort of a spin-off, very roughly positionality, but with an emphasis on critical engagement. Much more the process, much more the rhetoric, if you will. So really the job of us is not so much to shift toward cultures as much as shift toward the tools by which we examine and critique and are able to come to terms. The critique here back at this might be it's just a new fab form of skepticism. The third is to think of relational narrative literacy. And I'm not saying these are the only three. I'm saying there are three ways in and three ways to kind of resolve what Patricia Bazell does so brilliantly in the piece, which is set up and clearly explicate these two sides. Relational or narrative literacy would argue that we actually have to build what would be like almost a constellations. So when we look up at the stars are there, right? And they're there relative to the hemisphere and our time and space and as we're perceiving it from where we are on the ground. But they're the stars. So if you will, if we could make the analogy, there are factors in our society, right? Historical truths that we could say those things happened. Not necessarily we agree on the interpretations, but they're up there. So now comes that second layer of interpretation. Constellations come into play, and this is Malaya Powell's wonderful idea, along with her whole group, at what's called the Culture Lab, and she's at Michigan State. And this is the idea that we kind of, if you will, create sketches. We create schematics. We look up in the stars and we see, you know, Leo. We see Gemini. We see the Big Dipper, and we kind of draw, if you will, relationships between the stars. So a narrative literacy is the idea that we can create a story, if you will, from a certain amount of variables that will have its own impact, its own, if you will, cultural framework built in, baked in. And we think of cultures, and Malaya Powell is indigenous. And so she would say, hey, the stories inform a lot of how we are looking at what reality really is. And therefore, you know, the arguments of truth and classics and who says what and whether or not, you know, we're going to study a certain culture or another view really becomes secondary to the idea of informing the way that we are able to construct relationships or see and realize relationships. And I, in my own work, have kind of pushed this idea that we're not only biologically informed, I mean, they're just truths, right? As you discover things, you realize, oh, geez, I guess I am sucking in oxygen. So, hey, I'm relative, if you will, to the universe supplying that oxygen. I have a relationship, if you will, with literally chemicals around me, O2, okay, with H2O. And those are funny things to say. We would say, is that a relationship? Yeah, you could qualify it for sure. I would say that's a wonderful push to say it's not necessarily what we would think a give and go, but there is definitely an informant, meaning there are two elements that come together that cause a sense of purpose or definition. And in quantum mechanics, they talk a lot about this, and want to get too much in the weeds, that you don't know anything until you know its positionality, until you can measure, if you will, your relationship to something else. And that's really all I'm saying, is that we think about realizing the relationships we have with our family, realizing the relationships of some basic biological truths and things that inform us, things that at least are present, even if we don't fully narrate them or necessarily honor them or want them to be in play. And then, yes, that extra layer, that perhaps more constructive personal layer where we are not only positioning ourselves, but we're narrating a story or making some truth out of it. And here we think of literature as a way to, and mythology and religion as ways to tell ourselves stories in which we play roles, right? We're part of this constellation in some way, or we're creators of the constellation, self-admitted. So how certain cultural ways of knowing can promote or denigrate certain kinds of relationships can be a great way to think, hey, that's the purpose of cultural literacy. So the practical guys for this particular project, ask questions given in the prompts as we're going to show and post. And we went over last time in class, prompts on your musician and their song, and think about their positionality. Think about perhaps whether or not they're empowered in this given moment, given different variables to act as a very powerful pawn, if you will. And I put that in quote marks because we aren't just cultural pawns, but I'm using that again as an analogy so we can understand the forces that, if you will, set up an allowance of our moves what we're empowered or not empowered to do, what we might even have to defy, and what we can choose. So think about the positionality, perhaps, and then think possibly also about how the song displays skills. This would be along the lines of that second idea here of a more critical literacy, but the means to get knowledge and the means toward power and truth. So there's a lot of the ideas of combinations between the skills and the means to get to truth. Think about that. And that sounds a little bit generic, but if we think about even Kendrick Lamar's All the Stars, we might say that displays a certain skill set, um, in the sense that it is not only musicianship and beautiful artistry through the colors of the garbs and the contrasts of even, you know, the backdrops in that particular film, but it displays a skill of a journey, right? Of parsing through a journey to find truth. And the means here of Kendra going back to Africa, so to speak, to get knowledge and power and a sense of self-determined truth. All right, we might then kind of, if you will, bridging from that second point to the last, think about the relationships that that song realizes, disavows, or promotes. And here we might think of just reality checks. I mean, that song is in context, right? Historical factors that are informing it. What relationships it's avowing or disavowing. Oftentimes, especially pop songs, have some kind of personal context to them. The artist is coming out of some breakup, some, you know, romantic entanglement, some relationship with his audience, with his critics, with the industry. And so oftentimes that's going to play through. Sometimes it's with themselves, with an argument, with life, with a fight with drugs, or a resolution toward them. So we're realizing it and disavowing and promoting certain sensibilities, but they're really anchored in an idea of a relationship somehow. All right, that's it. I'm going to get into this next one in just a bit. I'm going to see if I can get out of this. It's always hard for me to do this without actually physically getting out. So I guess I'll go the full tilt here. All right, guys. Take care. I hope that was helpful. And I'll be posting another lecture here in just a second.